Welcome to One Spark at a Time. I'm Rabbi Adam Miller. There's a Jewish mystical legend that tells that during creation, something broke and shattered, scattering sparks of divine holiness around the world. It has become our responsibility to do acts of tikkun olam, to repair our world, knowing that each time we do a good deed, we are gathering one more of those holy sparks and, in the process, making our world a little more whole and holy. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by a wonderful individual who does this sacred work of repairing our world one spark at a time. My guest today is Rabbi Marla Feldman, the Executive Director of the Women of Reform Judaism, the WRJ. Prior to serving in that role, Rabbi Feldman serves as the Director of the Commission on Social Action of Reform Judaism and Director of Development for the URJ. Ordained at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, Rabbi Feldman is also a lawyer, having completed a JD at the University of Florida, and she recently edited issues of the Reform Jewish Quarterly on the topics of pay equity and gender in Jewish life. Rabbi Feldman, Marla, welcome to One Spark at a Time.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Rabbi Miller.
It's a delight to have you here, and I appreciate you making the time to join us for One Spark. For as long as I have known you, you've always been a passionate champion for justice in every arena. What first sparked this interest for you?
It's a really great question. I think it was bred in me from in my DNA, as I think it is for many of us. In thinking back on my formative years, I grew up in a classical Reform congregation with a pulpit-thumping rabbi who gave wonderful sermons. He was a little scary, but we heard growing up, we heard sermons about civil rights and racial justice, and this was in the 60s and early 70s, and so that was integrated into my understanding of what Judaism was from the earliest moment. My adolescence was bracketed by the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, and of course the Soviet Jewry movement. And I, when and where I grew up, to not be getting into good trouble was the anomaly, and that was the norm for us growing up. It was the era of the Vietnam War and equal rights, and the first AIDS was later, but the environmental movement was starting in the late 60s, and so all of those big movements in American life were part of my upbringing. So as I said, getting into good trouble was just part of what we did growing up. And I was very active in my youth group, which was Young Judea, a Zionist youth group. Grew up in a Zionist family. And we also got into good trouble there. So it really was very much part of my background growing up. So that when I went to college, I knew I wanted to work in the Jewish community. I couldn't have told you exactly what I wanted to do. And that activism was always a part of my Jewish identity. It really intertwined.
Well, you certainly have managed to get into a lot of good trouble. So you wanted to be involved in the Jewish community. What made the connection for you of going into the rabbinate?
That's an interesting question, because as I said a moment ago, I knew I wanted to work within the Jewish community from as long as I can remember. But I couldn't have told you exactly what that was. So when I went to college, I looked for a program that had a good Jewish studies program, and that's where I was. And I met with, as I was thinking about graduate school or what was next after college, I met with HUC recruiters every year. I went to University of Pennsylvania, and they came there every year. And one year I was thinking, well, maybe I would be a Jewish educator. So I talked to them about the education program. The next year I thought, well, maybe I'd go into communal service. And so I talked to them about the communal service program. And this was in the mid 70s. Not once did those recruiters say to me, you should think about the rabbinate, which when I look back on, I'm a little surprised, because women were in the program then, but there were maybe two at that point. So it really wasn't, it never occurred to me to be a rabbi. Not that I couldn't be, but that I would be. It just didn't occur to me. I didn't grow up with any role models of women in the rabbinate, but I was fortunate that I was in the Jewish Studies program with individuals that had been influenced by women clergy, women in leadership. And when I heard some of my women colleagues in the program talk about being rabbis or cantors, it was kind of like a light bulb going off. Well, I could do that too. And I remember a conversation with my family when I was in my last year of college, and my father was saying, "What are you going to do next? Are you going to graduate school? It's time to start thinking about these things." And I just kind of blurted out, "I'm going to apply for rabbinical school." I think he dropped the fork that was in his hand and, mouth wide open. And I could see the expression on my family's face from shock to thinking about it to, well, of course you are. It really was a very natural step, but until there were women role models and it became more normative, it just didn't occur to a lot of women like me that was a natural step. So I was fortunate that the doors had been opened, and that I was, able to pursue this vision for my Jewish life and Jewish career.
Well, as you mentioned, there weren't many up to that point. And in fact, next year we mark the 50th anniversary of the first American female rabbi, Rabbi Sally Priesand. Looking back, how does her journey relate to yours? And how have you been shaped by being among the first female rabbis?
I can't say that Rabbi Priesand's journey specifically influenced me because I was not aware of it at the time. The few women rabbis that were there were on the coasts, and I grew up in the Midwest. It was just not something that we had seen or were particularly aware of. So as I said, I was fortunate that I was influenced by others that had that experience. I can't say I was among the first. I was, maybe you could call it first generation. When I entered the rabbinical school program, there were maybe 5, less than 10, certainly, women rabbis at that point. But by the time I was ordained, there was almost 100. So in that 5-year period, the classes at HUC were between a third and a half women. And so it really, once we were in the program, it really snowballed. That said, in the communities that I served in the early part of my career, I was the first and only woman in those communities. So my first congregation was in Sarasota, Florida. My second congregation was in Orlando, Florida. And in both cases, I was the first woman and really a news story in those communities. And I can remember being at rabbinic conferences in your area in the Southeast. So the rabbinic conference of rabbis where there would be 100 people and I was the only woman. At that point, there were 2 other women rabbis in the state at that point, but if we didn't all go to the conference, you were on your own. But I have to say, in that experience, I was very fortunate. I had wonderful colleagues, and they were extremely supportive and attentive and interested in hearing my perspective, even though I was newly ordained and really didn't know anything. And these were my senior colleagues, but they really were wonderful and welcoming. And in those communities where I was the first woman, of course, there's always questions raised and some inappropriate comments because people don't know what to say. But for the most part, I found it gave me greater access. That being the first woman meant it gave me a platform. People wanted to meet, hear from, invite to speak. So I had a lot of opportunities in those early years to get out there, to talk about being a woman rabbi, to talk about being a rabbi, but in a new way and what that might mean for Jewish life. So it was the early part of my career was actually quite exciting for all of those reasons. And of course, now things have changed and, women are fully embedded. Doesn't mean the issues have gone away, but we're here and we're not going anywhere.
You referenced that it was both a platform and also at times challenging because you were breaking into new ground. Within the American rabbinate, where there's a growing awareness that while women and men receive the same title at ordination of rabbi, the treatment has not always been equal of them based on their gender. Can you share with us obstacles or challenges or moments when you have felt that sense of tension?
Sure. And I have to say with a caveat that I've been very fortunate, as I mentioned. I hear from colleagues situations that they faced that were quite negative and inappropriate and challenging. And I really did not face any of those. So I was very fortunate in that sense. You know, being the first meant a lot of people didn't know what to say and didn't know what to do. And so, you know, I dealt with the same kinds of comments that a lot of my colleagues dealt with, that some would today call microaggressions. For me, it was just part of being first and new and helping to educate people. But I think the one area where I can look back and say, yes, I have definitely been treated differently as a woman has been in the employment arena. I've never been paid equitably until I came to WRJ. So a shout out to my WRJ sisters who are on this call this morning. But seriously, until then, and this was, you know, after a 40-year career working in congregations, working in Jewish institutions, and working in the Reform movement institutions, not until this position have I been paid equitably compared to what we know now statistically are the pay scales that my male colleagues have enjoyed. And that has had a tremendous impact on my personal life, on the opportunities that I've had. It will have a tremendous impact on my retirement and what's in my retirement savings, where, you know, colleagues like you, frankly, probably are going to be much better situated than I will be, or my female colleagues, because we have been underpaid. So that is a real factor that I faced. The glass ceiling, absolutely. You know, were there some positions that I got because I was a woman early in my career? I think yes, because there were, I think at that point, places saying, well, let's try, let's give it a go. So I think I did have some opportunities because I was a woman, but I think there were many more opportunities that I didn't have because I was a woman. Many more places who said, well, you know, she'll get pregnant, or, you know, she'll move on when, you know, if she gets married, you know, and her husband gets a job, what will happen then? And of course, those are things that male rabbis just didn't, concerns that people didn't have about male rabbis. So those factors are still at play in the Jewish community. They certainly affected my career, and they continue to affect women's careers in the Jewish community, not just the Reform community. But I think there's a lot that we can do to get our own house in order, and you know, in the Reform community and in the larger Jewish community, and certainly beyond.
Thinking for a moment about, you encountered these things, as you said, among the first generation to be in these positions. We're now a couple of generations further along. How is the difference between your perspective and your reaction when you encountered those kinds of comments and treatment versus the new generation of female identified rabbis?
You know, I can only speculate about that because I'm not in the heads of
Sure.
my younger colleagues. I think that my generation of rabbis, maybe we had thicker skin, maybe we had fewer expectations of equality, that we knew going in, we were going to face some of these challenges. And we, you know, grinned and bared it. I think today, you know, women have been raised to be able to do anything and to have doors open and really have access to everything. And then when they get in a position where suddenly they are treated differently, it's a shock to the system. So I think part of it was expectations going in. I think my generation, we expected what we got, and we toughed it out and hopefully laid the groundwork for change. But I think today's women has, and this is a good thing, less tolerance for those microaggressions and less tolerance for sucking it up, and more demands for, it's time already. You know, we need to get our act together, and this is just inappropriate, and there's no excuses anymore. So I think that that's a good thing. I think this generation of women leaders will push the envelope further. You know, we did our share, and they are taking it that next step. And I think we all have a growing awareness that there's still a lot of work to be done.
There is a lot of work to be done, and recognizing the problem is just the first step. Solving it becomes more complicated. What do you think are some of the steps that we should be taking as a community or as individuals to address these gender gaps in the treatment of our spiritual leaders?
I think the first thing is recognizing it, acknowledging it, documenting it. So for example, as you know, one of the things that I do through my position with WRJ is co-lead the Reform Pay Equity Initiative, along with Rabbi Mary Zamor from Women's Rabbinic Network. So we decided to try to crack the nut on one very specific issue of pay equity. And of course, Rabbi Zamor has done a lot of work in the SRE, safety, respect, equity arena. But this was very laser focused on pay equity. And we really started with those statistics because we were starting to be able to document with salary data that what we knew was the case, now we could document and prove was the case, the salary inequality. So the first is to be able to document, to acknowledge, and in the case of safety, respect, equity issues, to acknowledge that it's a real thing that goes on in our community. So I think that's the first step, that we have to all admit it, recognize it, document it. And then the next step is to identify what are the best practices to address those inequities. In the case of the Reform Pay Equity Initiative, we did a lot of study and research into what are the best practices to address salary inequity. And we put that out there, and we brought together the leadership of all of the affiliates of the reform movement. And I have to say they've been willing partners in this. So that's all of the professional arms, and of course the URJ and HUC and CCAR, the alphabet soup of the reform community. So there are some really simple best practices that have started to be implemented within the reform community, and it's actually been modeled outside of our community as well. So we've also done some work with the conservative movement and the camping systems and others. Simple things like, what do you not ask during an interview? Things like past salary. If a woman has a suppressed salary and you ask her her past salary, it will continue to be suppressed throughout her career. So better to be transparent. Here's the salary for this position. Apply or don't apply. But if you ask someone their salary, then they'll be offered a lower salary than someone who asks for something higher. Training women to negotiate better. Training women to have higher standards for themselves. You know, women have really been socialized to take whatever they're asked for. And here's an example that through the Reform Pay Equity we heard about. It was from a temple administrator shared this, that the congregation had two positions. I believe it was for an educator, and they had lots of candidates. They settled on one male and one female candidate as their top choices. When they were engaged in salary negotiations, the woman was offered the job and said, "Great, thank you, I happily accept." And the male candidate said, "Great, thank you, I will accept if you make the salary 10% higher." So, you know, good for him, but we're socialized differently, right? So the congregation really had to think about, well, would they, with these two comparable positions, pay one person higher than the other? And they had to recognize that if they're going to raise one, they have to raise the other one also. So, you know, raising all boats is an important thing that can be done by male colleagues as well. Setting those standards and assuring that regardless of the gender of the candidate, they're going to be paid at a set amount. Another really simple best practice is that salary transparency in applications, so people know what they're applying for. And that is something that the CCAR and the URJ have already done with the Rabbinic Placement Commission, which is a joint commission, changed the application process. So now a congregation must inform candidates what the salary level is. And there was a lot of pushback, but the pushback allowed the Placement Commission to come back and explain to congregations why this is important. The next thing they're working on is implicit bias training search committees to understand that we all operate with biases. And if we at least understand that, we can try to correct for it. So there are some simple implementations. Back to your question, step one, acknowledging and documenting. Step two, identifying the tools to address it. Step three, which I think is really important, is accountability. Holding ourselves accountable, making sure we're doing these things and not just paying lip service. That's something that the Reform Pay Equity has done. We gather at least annually with the partners. What are you doing? What have you done? Have you changed your forms? Who is doing what, as a check-in to make sure that we're holding ourselves and each other accountable. And then I think the last step is, again, goes to documentation. So now we are working with the Reform Pay Equity Initiative on the next round of salary data to compare, are we making progress or not? And then it circles back to the beginning. So where are we? Do we need improvement? What are the steps to make improvement? How do we hold ourselves accountable? And then checking in, are we making progress? And then starting again. So those are the steps that I see. And you can apply that kind of pattern to SRE matters. Again, that's safety, respect, equity issues. What are the policies? What are the guidelines? Are we following them? Are we addressing appropriately the issues that we're finding and going back and, do we have to change our policies and processes?
So staying for a moment with the question of pay equity, put it in perspective for the audience who may not know this. Every year in the spring, there's a date that's set that identifies how much further from the previous year a female has to work in order to make an equal salary to her male peers. Put that in perspective for people. How much time difference is there between what a woman is receiving and what a man is receiving across society, not just in the Jewish community?
Right. So it's Equal Pay Day is the date. And, the good news is it does move very incrementally. It is usually a date in, it was April. I think it may have moved into March recently. And basically it's saying that for, if the with the pay scales the way they are, and women continue to earn 80 or 80, sometimes 90, depending on the career, percent of what her male colleagues similarly situated make. So how much further into the year would she need to work for it to be equitable? Personally, I think that they've done that wrong. I would have done it the other way, which would be to say, at what point in the year am I done working? Because you have only paid me for 11 months of work based on equity. And okay, so I'll stop in November, thank you very much. And I'll start again in January when you start paying me again. I think that would have been a better way to see it. But either way, it's how much longer does a woman have to work to have earned the same amount as her male colleagues, or how much less is she being paid for the same work, for doing the same work? And again, it's documented, it moves by a day or two, every year. So we're making progress, but I've seen studies that show at the rate of progress that we're currently making, it'll be 150 years before women statistically are earning equitable salaries to their male counterparts. And I can also tell you from the research we've done with the Reform Pay Equity Initiative, that within the reform community, within our congregations and reform institutions, we are statistically comparable to the rest of North American statistics. Canada, I think, does a little bit better than the United States. For professions, it is 85 to 90%, and that's where we are for clergy and Jewish educators. For other kinds of positions, it's 80 to 90%, and we are in line with that. So we get no brownie points. We're like everyone else, and we have the same work to do.
That leads me to a natural follow-up of where has the Jewish community been compared to the rest of the community on these gender equity conversations? Where have we lagged, and are there areas where we might be succeeding?
The reform movement itself was based in equity for women. And so if you look historically at the public statements and resolutions of the reform movement, and whether that's the Union for Reform Judaism or the Central Conference of American Rabbis, Women of Reform Judaism, certainly, you will see over the years a slew of resolutions calling for equity for women in law and advocating for legal fixes to some of these issues, as well as calling for things like passage of the ERA when that was active, which I'm happy to say it seems to be coming back a little bit, for marriage equality, for lots of social justice issues. You will see those statements. But that's different than the reality in our movement, as I was just saying. So we've said the right things. Our advocacy efforts on the larger matters of law and legislation, we've done the right things. We've advocating for the right things. But our institutions themselves have not been there. And that's where we need to improve. And the good news is, as I said, those reform institutions that we called together under the Reform Pay Equity Initiative have been willing partners. Are things moving as quickly as we might like? Perhaps not. And sadly, we've seen recently in the news cases of bad behavior and abuse, sexual abuse, and violations of sexual ethics. We're not immune from that either, just as we've seen in other faith communities. But what we're wrestling with now as a community is a recognition that our policies and procedures have not been in place to properly deal with those things. And victims remain victimized because their complaints were never properly addressed. And that's the reckoning that's going on right now in our community, that it's not enough to say these things shouldn't happen, but we have to have in place the mechanisms to protect victims and potential victims. And we have to use those tools, not just talk about those tools. So the reckoning now is twofold. One, to make sure that we've got better policies and procedures in place to assure ethical, moral, proper behavior in our institutions by employees and volunteers and lay leaders. And that when there are complaints, they are properly investigated and addressed. So that's going forward what we need to do. But we also need to look back a little bit and recognize that there are things in the past that were never properly addressed. And until they are properly addressed, victims continue to be victims. And so we really need to be focused on survivors of sexual abuse and what they need, not only for themselves in terms of therapy and other support, but also what they need to hear from these institutions. They need to know that they were heard.
And what do you think it says that, as you alluded to, there's been a couple of these incidents coming to light? What does it say that these are now being brought into the mainstream, that they're now being talked about, whereas in the past they might have been kept more quiet?
Right. Well, and I think that is that's where we're seeing that we're being somewhat successful in changing the environment. Hopefully, it means that people are feeling more comfortable speaking up, that complaints are not being swept under the rug. So, it's horrible that these things are going on. But if they do go on, hopefully now at least there are mechanisms for people to speak out, to be heard, for investigations to be made, and for proper action to be taken. So we'll have to see, is this a moment in time when people are talking about it, and so people are coming forward and it'll be a blip and we'll go back to business as usual? Or will we really institutionally change the nature of our institutions, our policies and procedures, and implement strictly those policies that we have in place? Because right now, in many of our institutions, we've got the right policies, but they haven't been followed, and that's what we're finding. So, we need to keep our eye on it. And that's when you were talking about the steps, that cycle of things, that's where it comes up. We need to continually double check. Are we following those procedures? Do we need better procedures? If not, go back to the beginning and do the research and implement, and then check again. Are we following them? Are we consistent in our application of our ethical policies and procedures?
I imagine that's a bit of an eye-opener for some who want these things to be, well, what are the steps we have to take? Great, we've taken those steps, it's done, as opposed to looking at it and saying it's a process, and we have to continue to review, revamp, and rethink what it is that we are doing. Within the Jewish community, as we talk about conversations around gender, and it might be helpful for you to talk about what that term means in your world, we're also very conscious of the fact that there are single gender organizations that have existed within the Jewish community, from youth programming like AZA and BBG to adult groupings like Men of Reform Judaism, Women of Reform Judaism, even the Women's Rabbinic Network within the Reform Rabbinic community. Where are these programs today, and what is their future in what I would think would be an increasingly non-binary world?
Well, thank you, Rabbi Miller, for that question. As you mentioned in my introduction, I just guest edited a CCIR journal issue that will be out hopefully this month on the question of single gender programming in the Jewish community. And I come to that from a perspective of heading a gender-based organization within the Jewish community. And I have to confess my bias. Working for Women of Reform Judaism, I see the power of women's programming. What happens when women come together, when their voices are not stifled and they can act with their full creativity and potential, and there's still a lot of learning that goes on. I've been surprised by things like our really basic speakers training, stand up straight, speak up, that kind of really basic training. Every time we do that, it's sold out, which says to me that there are a lot of women who lack the confidence for those kinds of public roles. And we provide a really important platform for that confidence building for leadership. So it's been a surprise to me that that is still needed for women in this day and age, but it is. So I see that we play a very important role in Jewish life. That said, I hear often, sadly, from colleagues, well, there's no need for a women's organization anymore. Women, the president of my congregation is a woman. We've got 2 women rabbis and a woman cantor and woman president, and women have made it, and there's just no need anymore. So what do I do with that? That dynamic that there are many people who say, well, there's just no need for gender-based. It's not an appropriate criteria anymore. And there's also the challenge that we have a growing awareness that gender is not binary. So the Jewish community was built on male or female if there were gender-based programs, but now we're recognizing that there are many in our community who don't fall into that binary yes or no, one or the other, but rather are in different places on the spectrum of gender. So all of these questions I was asking in this journal. And so it's a collection of about 15 articles with different perspectives. And I'm hoping it really will be the beginning of a conversation around these issues. I know what I think from my own experience, but I also know what I hear from others. So there's a conversation that needs to take place. Is gender still an appropriate criteria to use for identity-based programming in the Jewish community? I think that that's a reasonable question to ask. And so this issue wrestles with some of the questions. You'll see articles there from those who do gender-based programs and recognize, as I said, the power of them. So there's a rabbi who does retreats for women and what happens in those settings. There are articles from Men of Reform Judaism and about men's seders as well as women's seders. About programming targeted for girls and boys specifically, and what that makes possible for both of them in those safe environments. And at the same time, there's also articles from those who are really looking from the perspective of youth in particular, but others as well who are define themselves as gender nonconforming or non-binary in any number of ways, gender fluid, trans gender, and how do we make sure that those individuals have a place in our community if we're gender-based? So there's a balance that needs to come about. And I think even there's a recognition that for some people, it's an important place for individuals to find their voice, to get their leadership experience. At the same time, it is exclusionary. Just like age-based programs are exclusionary. We have youth programs because we recognize that there are certain reasons that youth want to get together and do things, but we're making assumptions about their interests. What if an adult wants to go to camp? We're making assumptions. Now with youth, it may be a little different because there's also perhaps some safety concerns. But at the other end of the age spectrum, we have programs for baby boomers and programs for seniors. We have programs for different family cohorts. Single adults or young married couples or parents with young children. We have lots of identity-based programs and now increasingly programs for Jews of color. for trans Jews, so there are lots of identity-based programs. We need to recognize they are by nature exclusionary of someone. We need to make sure that our communities are open and welcoming to everyone. But does that mean that every program in the community needs to be open to everyone? Or is there an appropriate place for these identity-based programs? So that's the question that I wrestle with in this issue. And they're all new questions. We didn't ask these questions before because it was male or female and everyone knew it. And, it was just, generally understood. And now we know that we were wrong, that there is a spectrum. And so our assumptions have changed, our knowledge has changed, our language is changing, and our programming is changing also. So what does that mean for legacy organizations like Women of Reform Judaism?
I imagine it's a difficult space for someone who wants to be an ally, and yet they know that they are not inside of the construct of the group. What do you recommend to individuals who want to be supportive for someone who's of a different gender or different identity than themselves? They're not part of the group, but they still want to support it and recognize there might be a need to have some unique programming, but how do I support that and not be able to participate in it?
Yeah, I don't think there's any great kiddush or, any special knowledge that I would have on that. I think if the groups strengthen the individuals in that group, strengthening those individuals strengthens our communities. So I don't think it negatively impacts the ability that strengthening people in one way doesn't negative impact the others who want to be supportive of that. But I think wherever we are allies and not insiders, to use your language, I think we need to listen and take our lead from those individuals. There's a large conversation going on right now, certainly in the Reform Jewish community, about how to better embrace Jews of color. They've been here for a long time and have not really been recognized, and they're organizing. And there are more programs and groups, and we're learning a lot by listening to them and what are their needs and how can we be allies to them. Not coming in and saying, here's what I think you should do. I need to listen on an issue like that. And in the area of gender, part of my working in this journal was to listen. I don't know how it feels to be in these other identity groups that I don't identify with, but I want to be an ally and I want them to be fully part of the community. And I also still recognize the value of a women's organization. So, how do we support each other with all of those differences? And I think it starts with listening. What are they saying? What do they need? Making sure that there's a space for their voices to be heard and lifted up, so that we can learn from each other.
So some questions coming in different formats. Susan asks about wanting to know how you made the journey from the congregational life of the rabbinate into organizational, particularly what brought you to the Religious Action Center, its work, and what you've looked back on and feel like was a success in a national policy area.
Oh, thank you for that question. My starting point was actually the reverse. I knew I wanted to do organizational work, and that's what I was describing before. I never really saw myself as a congregational rabbi. I knew I wanted to serve the Jewish community. I surprisingly would have, as a kid, a teenager, I would have described the work that I'm doing as what I wanted to do in the Jewish community. I wouldn't have named it. I wouldn't have said what the name of the organization was, but I would have described it. So when I went to HUC, I specifically chose to go to the New York campus because I wanted to get experience working in organizations. So I did. I worked for NIFTY. I was a crafty advisor at the time. It was City Region, a Federation of Temple Youth, of which Rabbi Jonah Pesner, who you interviewed, was one of the members of my crafty group. I worked for WRJ as an intern during that time. And I was a legislative assistant at the Religious Action Center during that time as a rabbinical student. It was a summer internship program at the time. So I knew I wanted to work at that level in the Jewish community. But I was fortunate that I had people that I really respected, colleagues who I respected. Joe Glazer, alav shalom, in particular, who was the executive director of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. And he also was a lawyer by training. And he really strongly, and others strongly advised me to get congregational experience. Their feeling was, don't rule it out. You may love it. And even if you don't, the experience will serve you well in whatever you do. And that was exactly the case. Loved my congregational experiences, learned a lot. And that foundation in Jewish life at the congregational level has really served me well throughout my career. But after 5 years of serving congregations in Florida, I really needed to think back about what my career path was going to be. Was that going to be the path, or did I want to go back to my plan A? So at that point, I actually decided to go back to school and get my law degree. I had originally debated whether to go to law school or rabbinical school. So I was interested in both, and the public policy work really interested me early on. So it was the right time to do that. And then I was able to really use both the law background and the rabbinic background in the community relations field. So I did that for many years, working in Delaware and Detroit. And that was a really great way to marry my interests in public policy, in social justice work, in community relations and community engagements and interfaith work, along with the rabbinic title and experience that allowed me to translate that into the Jewish community and represent the Jewish community in those arenas. And then I was very fortunate to have been invited by David Saperstein to take over as the director of the Commission on Social Action, which was like coming home. Then it was able to take all of those skills and that experience and work within the reform movement on that, which was a real blessing. And from there, there was a brief blip in my career of doing development work, which was, also frankly, a great opportunity for me to learn skills that are critical in the work that we do. So that was also a gift from the URJ to get that experience, all of which set me up very nicely to my work with WRJ, in which I'm using all of those skill sets that I've learned throughout my career, including the social justice work that we do. So it's been a fabulous career. I've really loved it, and had I've not been bored with what I've had the chance to learn lots of different things and work in different ways. To the question about particular successes, I can look at several. When I look back on my career, and at this stage in my life, I'm doing more looking back than forward. I remember a question I was asked once in an interview. The person interviewing me asked, "Are you a starter or are you a finisher?" And I had to really stop and think about that. Do I, like to launch new things and then hand it off to someone else? Or do I like to, take something and really, see it to the end? And I realized that I'm, I think, more of a starter than a finisher. So when I look back on my career, I look at those things that I really helped to start, and that gives me, frankly, great pride. Going back to the 1980s, when my career was really starting, that was also the time when AIDS was just being recognized as what it was. And I was doing a lot of youth work at the time. So it was 85 to 90. I was in congregations, and I was either the youth advisor of those congregations or supervising the youth advisor. And it was a life and death matter for youth to get proper education. So I became the AIDS rabbi. So I started with some colleagues from other faith traditions, an AIDS support network, and this was at a time when AIDS patients in hospitals were not getting their meals delivered because people were afraid to step into their room. They were being evicted from their homes. They were being, losing jobs. I mean, there were some really serious issues going on, and there was a lot of lack of education and fear. And we had youth that, like it or not, they were sexually active, and they needed to know how to protect themselves. So as part of this organization, there was a rabbi, a priest, a minister, and we were like a panel. We would speak all over the community about AIDS and try to raise awareness. So that was, one of the first examples of something that I really saw a need in the community and felt very proud of the work that we did. Years later, when in the 90s, I was working in the community relations field, and it was the time of the war in Bosnia. And we were reading about atrocities going on and frankly, genocide. If you remember, I remember opening the paper one day and reading about Srebrenica, which some of your callers may remember, and reading this article about hundreds of people who were rounded up and no one knew where they were. And I just had this horrible feeling. I knew where they were, and anyone who studied the Holocaust knew where they were. And it was just a devastating thought that, we who say never again, were literally watching it. So I worked with, again, some interfaith colleagues, and we formed, at the time, it was the Delaware Coalition for Bosnia, and plugged into a national network of organizations trying to engage the United States public policy on that issue. And we did. So there again, I felt very proud of the work that we did in bringing awareness to an issue. And in fact, President Biden at the time was the senator. And I had many meetings in his office with him and his staff about this issue. And he was a true ally on engaging the United States militarily if necessary. Later, through the work with the URJ, I take particular pride in the work that we did as a movement after Katrina in supporting not only our communities in New Orleans and helping them recover, but also the larger community. The reform movement raised millions of dollars, and I had the fortunate position of allocating those dollars, of meeting with local agencies and partners and finding ways to really help rebuild that community. And then finally, one other example, which is a little more recent, was the work that we did when I was the director of the Commission on Social Action, partnering with an organization called Nothing But Nets. So as I said, we have policy on lots of different things. So we have lots of policy on global poverty and the needs of developing communities, but we weren't doing anything. We don't have congregations in Africa. South Africa, we have some, but we just were not there. So how do we get our hands around this issue? So we partnered with this organization called Nothing But Nets, which provides mosquito nets, malaria nets to developing countries. So there again, not only did we launch this initiative within the reform movement, and we raised over $1 million to provide relief from malaria, protection from malaria in developing worlds. And by the way, the malaria rates plummeted as a result of this tremendous international effort. But we also connected that with other passions of the reform movement, which was about refugees and the issue of Darfur. There's another one. So I was on the founding board of the Save Darfur Coalition, which I also take great pride in the work that we did. But so when the reform movement was looking at this work in dealing with global poverty, we also were looking at the situation in Darfur and refugees. And so we partnered with the UN Foundation, to dedicate our work to refugee camps that was run by the UNHCR. So that was not something that anyone else was doing. They were partnering with governments, and no governments were dealing with the refugee camps because they may be located in their borders, but they're not run by the government. So we, through the work that the reform movement did, we completely covered refugee camps in 3 countries in Africa and made a real difference. So I take really tremendous pride, not just in the role that I had, but in the fact that I work for a movement where people respond, where we recognize that Darfuri refugee living in a refugee camp in Chad deserves to be free of malaria, and that we have something to do, and that for $10 we can make sure that kid is protected. So I take great pride in some of those things that I've done in my career.
And you should. It's been a mountain of good trouble that you've gotten into over
Yeah.
the years. Going from past accomplishments and looking ahead, if you had a crystal ball and we're looking 5, 10, 25 years down, where do you hope to see us in terms of justice, of gender equality, and in the same time, what keeps you up at night as you look ahead?
You know, it's really hard to look ahead because I think most of us in Jewish life and leadership recognize that we're in a point of transition. We know our community is transitioning. My career began with the model of suburban congregations. It was a post-World War II model with programming, youth groups, young adult groups, all those different groups. And that's the way the Jewish community connected. Federations, we didn't talk about Israel at all today. And of course, today, sadly, there's so much to talk about with Israel. That could be a whole another session. But, the Israel advocacy and the work that federations did in their community, that was the structure of the community in which we worked. And we knew how to get things done. We knew, people connected. But now we're living in a very different era. That people are not connecting in the same way to the Jewish community. It doesn't mean they're not connected, but they're not connected by joining these institutions to the same degree as they used to. So if we want to engage the next generation of Jewish people, if we want to cultivate the next generation of Jewish leaders, we need to find new ways to do it. Thank goodness for the Reform camping system, which is doing it in remarkable ways. So kudos to them. I think that a lot of our leaders are really coming from there. But I think with the exception of the camping system, everything else is changing, that congregations have to change. The way our institutions in Jewish communities like federations need to change. I don't have the answer of what they need to change to. We're in the midst of seeing that change is needed. People are voting with their feet. They're just connecting in different ways. So we need to be creative. We need to be dynamic. We need to, what's the expression, throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall. We need to try a lot of things. We need to be willing to fail. And when we look back, hopefully we will see what succeeded. And that will then characterize the future. In terms of what keeps me up at night, there's a lot of things that concern me, about the day-to-day world, and certainly what's happening in Israel right now is devastating and sad and tragic. But for the most part, I actually sleep pretty well at night. I have a lot of confidence in people, and therefore I have a lot of confidence in the future. That whether you and I figure this out or someone else figures it out, I think that there will continue to be a viable and vibrant Jewish community. I think Jews will actively connect and find one another. Being the head of Women of Reform Judaism, I'm confident that Jewish women will continue to find spiritual and meaningful ways to gather together and connect to do the important work that we do today and that they will do in the future. So I may not be able to do that with them or visualize what they will need in the future to make that happen, but I am very confident that it will happen, that Jewish leaders will continue to engage, that Jews will continue to engage, that Jewish women will continue to be active and forward-thinking. So I have a lot of confidence in the future. So the things that keep me up are the things like that I have to do tomorrow. But the long-term future, I have a lot of confidence about.
A beautiful and inspirational way, I think, for us to end our conversation. Rabbi Feldman, thank you so much for joining me today for One Spark and sharing your passion for justice and making our world a better place.
Thank you. It's been really a pleasure to be with you, Rabbi Miller. Thank you.
Oh, well, it's been great getting to hear your story. And I want to thank all those who are listening in our audience. If you missed any part of our experience or want to catch up on other engaging conversations from the past, you can check out One Spark at a Time on Apple Podcast, where you can download, listen, and follow the podcast, One Spark at a Time. Our next guest will be Rick Hart from Lighthouse of Collier, who will share his remarkable passion for assisting people who are blind or visually impaired with the use of technology. As we conclude, we do so, as always, with a beautiful teaching from Gandhi. Be the change you want to see in the world. Know that each and every one of us has a power to embrace this teaching and make it a reality, that every one of us has the power to fix our broken world, one spark at a time.